This is Blue Left, a podcast dedicated to amplifying the underrepresented Democratic voices in Tennessee, working tirelessly to bring progressive change to the volunteer state. Here's your host, Peggy Kingsbury.
Well, hello, everybody. This is Peggy Kingsbury, your host, and I'm excited to bring you Blue Lift today. As always, we have a fantastic guest and someone who's going to teach us some things today, which is always good when we can learn a little bit. Today, we have my friend, Dr. Mona Ivey-Soto. Dr. Ivey-Soto is an associate professor in the College of Education and the Global Honors Program at Belmont University. We're going to talk a lot about what she does at Belmont, so I'm not going to waste our time here going through every little sentence of her extensive biography because she is such an accomplished woman. I'm really, really proud that she's in my circle. It makes me smile. It makes me happy. Dr. Ivey-Soto has a Bachelor of Arts in Political Science and Sociology from New York University, a Master's of Education from Bank Street College, which is also in NYC, a Master's in Social Work from Silberman School of Social Work at Hunter College, and a PhD in Special Education and Clinical Sciences from the University of Oregon. As always, we bring the smartest and the best to Blue Lift. One of the things that Dr. Ivey-Soto also does is she has started a grassroots organization, and we're going to talk about that as well. It's soon to become a full-fledged nonprofit, and it's doing some really important work, and it's really one of the things that brought us together as friends. Mona gave me the opportunity to give to some things that I really trust and believe in. So welcome, Dr. Ivey-Soto.
Thank you so much. It's truly an honor to be here. Never been on a podcast, but I'm loving that this is my first opportunity, and what a gift to be on it with my dear friend Peggy. So thank you for this opportunity to share about work that I'm so passionate about, and to be a voice in being part of change in our state, and to be alongside other voices. I was looking at some of the other people that you've interviewed before. So also just to be among other really incredible voices who are doing such powerful and transformative work. It's an honor.
Well, thank you. Thank you so much. I know that this might be your first podcast, but you've done about 300 or more keynote speeches. So talking about your work and what you do is something that I know is important to you, and it's a good way to get the message out. And I'm honored to have you here today. So let's just dive right in. And I want you to tell the listeners what your position is at Belmont and how that came about.
Sure. So I've been in higher ed really since 2008. I started just as I was finishing my PhD, working for a community-based program in upstate New York. Working with middle schoolers and their families, and then transitioned into a faculty role once I finished my PhD. And at that time began teaching future educators. So really was passionate about preparing teachers for the landscape of education and for what the classroom and the community required of them. So I worked in a small liberal arts college and then a large state university in New York State, and then transitioned to Belmont University in 2015 when our family relocated down to Nashville. And that's been just a wonderful opportunity for us to be embedded in an urban community. I love Nashville. I love what Belmont has provided. Being a faith-based institution that's really committed to justice. And I've had an opportunity to teach site-based courses at some of the schools in Nashville and at community organizations as well. So we've been able to help our students really learn about what teaching and learning looks like in a community-based setting, with the populations of students that we're going to be serving right when they're starting in their education courses, which has been great. And then I get a chance to teach in our Global Honors Program, which I absolutely love. So that reaches students across all different majors at Belmont. So those are students who are studying all different disciplines and also have decided to take a rigorous program through Global Honors. And I love that. One thing that I have been really honored to do in my role at Belmont is design almost every course that I've taught, which is really unique.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
That is unique.
So
Yeah.
pretty much every class that I've taught in our undergraduate, graduate, and PhD program, I've been able to design from the ground up. And so that's been really special. We just launched a PhD program within the last, I think, year and a half. And I teach a course called Equity and Social Justice Leadership that I've been able to build. And that's been really special. Teaching doctoral students who are going to be leaders in the field has been really wonderful. We have students from all over the country who are part of that program. And so that's been really just dynamic to meet incredible leaders who are doing just transformative work in higher ed, in community-based settings, in schools, and just watch their journey. A lot of them, this information is still new to them, learning about kind of the history of racial inequality. And for some of them, it isn't new, but just watching them journey together and think about how their leadership can be impacted by racial justice and how they can embody a position of equitable leadership in their own role has been really special. So
I want to stop you right there, because one of the things that I know that is mentioned in your bio, and one of the things I know is really a central part of your work, is teaching educators how to deal with and teach and mentor and foster marginalized communities. Tell our leaders, tell our listeners, who may also be leaders, tell our listeners what is a marginalized community?
yeah, so I think that's a community, and research tells us that that's a community that has been historically and often currently overlooked and underrepresented. And so that is often communities of color and in our urban and could be rural spaces, but they're communities that have been under-resourced, underrepresented, communities that have been overlooked by government, by resources, by policies. And so they're communities that have been often left out of the conversation. They've been left out of funding sources. So it's really important that those voices are elevated and amplified. They're often communities that are not given the same access to resources in terms of schooling, in terms of healthcare, in terms of employment. Whenever there are major systems that are in place that many of us who live in more privileged communities take for granted, those are the kinds of things that are often not offered at the same access points to marginalized communities. So, and sometimes when we're thinking, particularly in a state like Tennessee, that is more of a rural state, right? The majority of our state is pretty rural.
Right.
You may go in many rural communities, and those marginalized communities may not look black and brown. They may not be communities of color necessarily. So those marginalized communities may not be divided by race, but are definitely divided by class, right? So, when we think about high poverty rates in our rural communities, upwards of 22 to 25%. Those communities may be majority white, but that's more than almost 1 in 5 residents in some of those communities that are dealing with poverty, right? So we're thinking about those are marginalized communities. They may not be communities of color that in the same way that it would look like in Nashville or Memphis or Knoxville or Chattanooga, but those are communities that are definitely dealing with marginalization based on social class.
So when a new teacher shows up to the classroom and she has not had the opportunity to learn about marginalized communities, and let's say it's a new teacher in a rural area of Tennessee, and I know a lot of people who live in rural areas of Tennessee. Many of the teachers come from families who also teach. It's just what they do.
Right.
And many times they are white young women who have been raised in a community where they have been financially secure. So this young woman shows up to teach, and she has not had the opportunity to learn about marginalized communities. What has she missed out on that she might need in the classroom?
So I think one of the things that students don't understand is often the cyclical nature of poverty in marginalized communities. the ways that we see how marginalized or under-resourced communities lack, as we said before, access to a lot of the just basic things that many of us take for granted. So kids are often coming to school, especially in the early grades, with what we would see as, the quote unquote word gap or language gap. So they often are, underprepared for some of those kind of early literacy or early language skills that we need are necessary. And again, I think we want to be careful that we're not making generalizations, because we don't want to do what a lot of scholars talk about is essentialize about poverty, is making these statements that cover kind of to say that all the kids that are living in these communities, whether that be urban or rural, they don't all carry these characteristics. Certainly. I mean, I spend a lot of time in public housing communities in Nashville, and some of the most brilliant and amazing kids come from the zip codes that also have the highest crime, highest levels of incarceration rates. And so we want to be really careful that we don't essentialize and make blanket statements about any neighborhood or any zip code. But we also want to be diligent in our preparation and in our intentionality and understanding that there are things that we want to prepare future educators or future, people who are working in these communities to say there are some things that are you're likely to encounter from students and families who lack those resources, who have been often, left out of the system, or who have not been served well by the system. And so that looks like, things like being underprepared often for school. That can look like kids who come to school hungry, so they might be a little bit tired and, not being able to sustain a full level of attention during the school day.
Right.
Because they don't have access to proper nutrients at home. Sometimes that can look like, behavioral issues that are untreated, because of, maybe some trauma or ACEs, adverse childhood experiences. Again, not every child. I always say when I teach, I do a lot of teaching about ACEs as well. I always say not every child in poverty has ACEs, and not everyone who has ACEs is living in poverty.
And again, for the listeners, ACEs
are adverse childhood experiences, and that's a survey that was developed by some physicians at Kaiser Permanente, a hospital in California, that helps us to understand early childhood adversity and kind of understand early trauma. And there's a lot of correlation between early risk and adversity and poverty. There's a lot of correlation there, but not every person or individual living in poverty has, trauma. There are certainly individuals living in, middle class and upper middle class homes who have ACEs. And I see that all the time when I talk about ACEs in my classroom at Belmont. There are families who are living in very privileged environments who have exposure to ACEs.
Sure.
But again, for teachers in rural or urban environments, and even, in some suburban environments, because research tells us that poverty is actually growing the fastest in many suburban environments because of what we see as urban sprawl, and gentrification in many urban communities. As things are pushed outward, families are having to find, we can't even say it's affordable housing, but housing in communities outside of the urban core.
Right.
And so really what I tell my students is, you think you might be going back to your little suburban community for, what you think is the quote unquote ideal classroom. And I really tell them to get away from all of that language of, I don't want to teach here because it has this issue, or I want to go back to what's comfortable for me. You need to be prepared to work with any type of student in any setting, because our classrooms are changing. And we really also should embrace all students in all communities everywhere, because
that's a good point. I hadn't really thought about the fact that urban sprawl does push out certain communities, and then they wind up in suburbia.
Mm-hmm.
That's a really good point that you make. So are there professors at other universities who also teach what you teach, or is that fairly specific to Belmont?
Oh, absolutely. I think there are a lot of faculty who care deeply about the community. I think one of the things that our College of Ed at Belmont is deeply committed to is being present in the community in a way that's very intentional, and making sure that our relationship is reciprocal, that we're going in and we're truly giving back to the classrooms and the communities that we're a part of. We have really, like I said, unique relationships, not only with schools, but community-based programs. We are connected with a program called The Branch in Antioch that does amazing work with refugee and immigrant families. I mean, just so many different collaborative partnerships.
So let's talk about that for a minute, because you said one of the magic words that we've all been thinking a lot about: immigrant communities and refugee communities. I guess the future is a bit scary for those families.
Absolutely.
Is this something you all are talking about in your classrooms at Belmont, about how to deal with the uncertainty these families must be feeling?
I mean, definitely. And in fact, our education students, right after the election, they actually led a nonpartisan, but they had a panel discussion that they led on how education, should I don't know if they titled it "Should React," but how should education kind of respond to the upcoming changes, given what's happening in the political sphere. And I was really proud of them because they wanted to keep it an open conversation, but they wanted to help, I think, the broader Belmont campus, but also within the realm of K-12 education, respond to some of these things and really keep it focused on how can we create our classroom as a safe and inclusive environment. But given the fact that, yes, our students are very concerned about these issues, families have fear, right? We saw, in the last Trump presidency, when ICE officials were going around and, removing families, we saw in the Nashville community, families stopped sending their kids to school for several weeks at a time because,
which is, yes, and I've read that, and I think that's a byproduct that a lot of people don't think about, is that many immigrant communities, immigrant families will just sort of go underground.
Yeah.
And we're talking, about children who had zero influence on the way they may have arrived in the United States.
Absolutely.
And, we can talk about the immigration system and what needs to be changed there and how it needs to be overhauled. And, we do that on Blue Lift sometimes. And I'm currently speaking with a guest I'm hoping to book who's very involved in the immigration process and who will talk to us about that. So I don't want the listeners to think that I don't realize and understand that our immigration system needs a lot of work. But I also know that my concern and love for the life and health and welfare and education of a child is greater than any of those things. And when you have a child in first or second grade who has been here most of their lives, maybe brought here as a very, very young child, to imagine how they must be feeling during these times, because children hear a lot of things, right? They hear a lot of discussion, and then the idea that the families will just stop sending them to school out of fear is very, very sad.
I mean, I have already had encounters with families who have asked me about, resources because their children are dreamers, right?
Right.
They're DACA recipients, Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals. And, these are things that are hitting very close to home in terms of.
And are they asking you who they might be able to leave their child with? Is
Absolutely.
that what they're asking?
Yeah. Or, where do I go and get forms notarized? Because my child, I need to make sure I have all my paperwork in order should this happen. And, what do I do about this particular situation should this arise? Now, again, things are very uncertain and we're not sure how things are going to unfold, but these are very real concerns on the hearts and minds of parents. in mixed status families, right? Where maybe you have a child who was born in the U.S. but the parents are undocumented, or you
Right.
have a child who is a dreamer, and so it's a very frightening time for a lot of people. And again, you know, none of us, I don't have all the answers either, but I think it's just important to be sensitive to these things. And as we tell our students to be able to create environments that are safe and loving and honor the emotions that kids are bringing and the real range of experiences and emotions that they're feeling, and make space for that in the classroom and wherever you are.
That's so important. And to me, that's truly a pro-life stance,
Absolutely.
right? We're
Absolutely.
we should be pro-child. We should, we're the wealthiest nation in the world. We should be able to love on children regardless of
Absolutely.
how they got here, who they live with, etc. Well, let's talk a little bit about the future with vouchers. Now, for the listeners who are in other states, you may not know that one of the things that the Tennessee legislature is going to take up in January, as soon as they get back, is passing universal vouchers. They're going to phase it in for a year or two, and then basically, if the plan goes through as written, it's just going to be completely universal. Anyone can do that. So we know that our schools, our public schools, will take a big hit, because what the vouchers will do is take the money that the state gives each school system to educate children, which is also not all of the money that's involved in educating a child. People misunderstand that. The federal government gives quite a bit of money for public schools as well. So, but they're going to take Tennessee's portion. And in some cases, they're going to take a little bit more than the state gives the counties, because some of your wealthier counties don't get as much per head, which I don't have a problem with. But they're going to take that money and let a parent use that money for either homeschooling or any kind of private school. We'll see how the bill lands, but it's looking right now like any kind of private school, and probably there will be very few regulations on those private schools. What are you all thinking about that in higher education? What are you telling your students? What do you anticipate?
So I think we have to be careful in higher ed. I mean, even as faculty members, and I'm somebody, my students will always tell you, we always know Dr. Ivey-Soto has very strong opinions on things, but we try to, I always say, I'm setting the table for you, and you have to pick up the things that you want to pick up. But I try not to insert a lot of my own stance on things, but I will tell you what the research says. And I will tell you in this setting what my own opinion is, which is that vouchers are absolutely catastrophic for our low-income communities. And again, be that rural or urban, or even our low-income families that live in suburban communities. Because even in Williamson County, where you and I live, there are low-income families,
Sure, there are.
that are where we are, and in other.
Yeah, we have an unhoused population.
Absolutely.
We've had Dr. Riggs on to speak with us about
exactly.
that.
So if vouchers are passed in the state of Tennessee, it's catastrophic for our state. We know that 14% of our population live in poverty. We have some of our rural communities like Putnam and Greene County where poverty rates are hovering around 22%. That's pretty high.
It is.
That's around, 1 in 5 individuals. And again, when you look at the population of children in that can be even higher. So this is a lot of individuals. And if you've spent any time, I've driven even around our state, we have, some efforts in the College of Ed working across our state. And, and I'm sure you have too, just driving around the state, you can see some communities that are very under-resourced and underserved.
Yes.
So in addition to that, these communities do not have access to, there are not private schools that these vouchers are going to be, working for in these other schools. So if you think about in our rural communities, if a family has a voucher, how many of these communities are operating in large numbers for homeschooling or private schooling in a rural community? Not very many, because where do you find, a robust private school community in very rural communities? You just don't. Not in the same way that you would in, maybe Nashville or Memphis or someplace where there are a lot of quote unquote school choices or school options. In addition, those private schools or parochial schools are very costly. The voucher does not cover that cost. So again, for low-income families, there's a huge gap between what the voucher covers and what the cost of that school is.
Right.
So for low-income families, they can't meet that gap. So for a middle, I would even say not even middle class, but for an upper class family, the voucher is great for them because this is quote unquote free money for them. So for them, choice works great. But for everyone else, it's not a choice, right? It's a lack of a choice. And so it's diverting funding away from public education, which in many urban communities and definitely in rural communities, the public school is the anchor in those communities. It is the place that is, it serves as the main source of community within those spaces.
Well, and in many of our rural counties, the public school system is the largest employer in town.
Absolutely.
And the highest paid workers.
Right.
Not that they don't deserve to be paid more. Let's not
Right.
go crazy
Right.
on that. Well, and so Mona, the thing that really, makes me think with my background in criminal justice and my life experiences, I know that any time a government program comes up, it's always wise to anticipate how that program might be abused by people. We see it happen over and over and over again. And in this particular case, the victims of that program being abused will be children and their education.
Mm-hmm.
So I anticipate if vouchers are passed in Tennessee, as we expect they will be, and if the bill has, very few pointed guidelines about what a private quote unquote school can do with the money, I anticipate the abuses to happen very quickly. It won't be long before some families figure that, well, gosh, I don't really want to homeschool my kids, but I've got 4 of them, and if I get X amount of dollars per year for each kid, that's just some great money for my family. Let me just buy an online program and I'll call myself a homeschooler.
Right.
Or you have Miss Mary who's going to open up a school in the church basement, and she's going to sit there with 25 kids. And you do the math on that. Miss Mary's going to have a little bit of a salary. The church gets a little extra money. And the kids are going to watch videos all day, and they're going to call that a school. I mean, these are my concerns.
Absolutely.
And also you could have some fringe groups that will start schools you could have something as crazy as, a school where, the children have to learn how to shoot guns every day. I mean, you just never know. We should never be shocked about the ways in which people will take advantage of a program.
Absolutely. And again, like you said, the lack of accountability, there's really nothing built in that's showing that there's going to be some oversight that's going to be really of any level of what we're seeing with public education. That's very concerning.
Right. And I think too that, excuse me, before we think that, well, if there aren't any private schools to go to in a rural community, then the voucher program won't affect that community at all. Well, there are people in rural communities who have the time and the finances to drive their child a couple of counties over to a private school, and you'll see that happening. And there could be enough of those where it really does affect the economy of the public school. And also, we would be unwise to forget that private schools don't have to take every student.
Mm-hmm.
Now, private schools may want to take the great athletes, regardless of their learning ability, but students with disabilities will be left out of this equation completely.
Right.
Because private schools don't have to take all students.
Right.
That's very sad.
It is. And I mean, you think about the progress that was made under the Individuals with Disabilities and Education Act, IDEA. I mean, all of these things can be completely rolled back because again, there's none of that. There's none of that oversight to say, well, we are mandated to do this because these are private schools, and they can just say, we don't have to do this.
That's right.
And there's no requirements to follow this if more of the funding is being diverted in that way.
Right.
So
And-
it's frightening to think about the amount of power that this can grow into and without any accountability.
Well, and I'm not usually one who's like a doomsday person, but I can see some of the students in your course right now, in your classes right now, who may wind up if they say, I want to stay in Tennessee and I want to teach in a public school, they're going to have a classroom full of marginalized students, aren't they?
Well, I mean, I think we see that already in many ways. I mean, Nashville is an interesting city because you have even schools, again, not getting too deep into the weeds here, but I mean, even in some communities, in parts of Nashville where even the public school does not reflect the demographics of the community because of, and it's not vouchers, but it's white flight in those communities because parents can afford private schools.
Right.
So you think about how and that's that's a smaller level, but I think about what vouchers could do. Like that could happen in whole larger level, like on a much larger level, right? So maybe that's one public school in one part of a community, but like what this could do is, yeah, it's much, much greater.
Right. And I know that from my own experience, I know we do see in some of our rural communities some self-segregation of schools because, if you have a county with 4 high schools in it, a lot of your families know exactly where they want to move to, or they can even go and request their child go to a specific public school.
Mm-hmm.
And we see that self-segregation is kind of a big thing. So let's switch gears a little bit and diversity, equity, and inclusion, DEI. That's really become to a lot of people a dirty word, which I don't understand because I love to ask people, well, what is it you don't like? Diversity, equity, or inclusion? Which of those 3 don't you like?
Mm-hmm.
And when you break it down that way, some people will say, well, I guess I like them all. I just don't want it forced on me, But a big part of DEI work, I know, includes working with students and people who take your seminars, et cetera, on something called implicit bias. Tell us what that is.
Yeah, so it's interesting. I spend a lot of time, I'm asked a lot, and especially it was interesting right after 2020, I was asked a lot to do a lot of trainings on implicit bias. And I always tell people I won't train or do any work on implicit bias unless you have me talk about what structural racism is at the same time, because I don't think it's helpful to talk about what bias is unless we talk about what racism is, because they're 2 different things, and it's important for people to understand how they're different.
So teach us that.
Yeah. So I'll talk about the differences there, because I think a lot of people, and we hear sometimes in the media that people can use those terms interchangeably, and they are different. But first, implicit bias, I think it's important to recognize what that is. So I'll just kind of read a little bit of like a textbook definition just to kind of keep that fairly, I guess, straightforward.
Okay.
But that is, and if we look at it from like a psychological perspective, it's also referred to as implicit social cognition. And it looks at what so everyone's susceptible to that. It looks at our attitudes, our stereotypes that everybody kind of has, and it's the ways that our understanding, actions, and decisions are impacted in an unconscious manner. So if you think about all of our thoughts, all of the things that are coming at us, all of the ways that those things impact our thinking, about 80% of what lives in our brain lives in our unconscious, and about 20% of our thoughts live in the conscious part of our brain. So when I remember growing up, my mom would say to me, you're not using your whole brain. And that's sort of like a true statement when you think about that unconscious and conscious part of our brain. And the reason why our brain kind of sorts our thoughts in that way is because we have about 11 million bits of information that we're kind of receiving per second. And if you think about it like a sorting system, so not many people carry cash anymore, but if you think about when you go to the bank, if you ever go to like put money in the bank and it sorts your bills, that's sort of what our brain is doing when it's taking information. It's sorting that information into systems within our brain. And our brain can only handle about 40 to 50 bits of information per second, but yet we're taking in way more than that, right? So, and then all of that is filtered by, again, everything that's happening around us, the media, all of those things, which are then influenced by the culture, which is influenced by race, gender, social class, all of these identity layers.
Right.
And that's how bias seeps in, right? Which are influenced by our family, our community, where we grew up, all the messaging, as well as history, all of the embedded, social norms that are a part of, the historical context within which we grew up, what part of the country, what part of the world we're from, our own cultural upbringing. So if we think about all of those layers, all of those things influence our implicit bias, our implicit social cognition.
And so just to review, everyone has implicit bias because
Everyone
we all
does.
have a background, we all have a
Right.
backstory, we all have a
Right.
bio,
And everyone has a mind, right? And everyone has a
Right.
brain, and we all have thoughts, right? So all of us have biases, and they're not just limited to race. They're, if we think about all of the identity markers, race, class, gender, religion, sexual orientation, body type, language, immigration status. All of the different, there's, 15 or more different identity markers. There's things that we could label a biased response to about so many different parts of who we are and who other people
Right.
are based on our exposure, based on the limited information that we have. We might feel really comfortable with one identity group, but less with another, right? Based on how much time we've spent around people, based on the limited information we have about one identity group versus another, based on who we consider our in group and out of group, right? Based on, again, the type of community we grew up in. If we grew up in a community where there were a lot of different types of families, a lot of different social class groups. If we grew up in a school where students of color were perceived in a very particular way versus a more broad way. There's so many things.
And we carry all of that
All
with
of that
us.
goes into, again, all of those pieces of information that are
Right.
downloaded. If we think about it being downloaded like in a computer, like our hard drive, right? And so we have to kind of think about how are we wiping our hard drive clear? We don't just do that by saying, oh, I just forget that. We have to think about taking that unconscious part of our brain and making it conscious. And so we do that by really, again, social psychologists tell us we think about how to make the unconscious conscious. This is like a whole day workshop. I'm trying to bring it to you in like 2 minutes. But we have to think about, so if I find myself somewhere and I notice that I see someone who looks different from me or worships different from me or dresses different from me, and I have a biased thought that comes into my mind, what researchers tell us is we should engage that thought rather than saying, oh my gosh, why did I think that way? Or, oh, instead of thinking I'm a bad person, we should say, oh, I just noticed I had that thought about whatever that person was. Think about it, hold it in our mind. Ideally, we've had some experience with that people group to balance that thought. And this is where if we have a robust life experience with diverse groups of people, that's where we begin to rid ourselves of those biases. Because if I can say, oh, well, I have groups of friends and deep community with people who look like this or worship like this or are part of, whatever, then my brain can replace those bias experiences with, wait, Mona, you have friends who are part of that group. You have all these experiences.
Right.
because all those experiences don't replace bias, right? It's that whole thing of like, well, I have a fill in the blank friend.
Yeah.
Doesn't mean that means that you can't be biased, but you at least have these experiences to help your brain reset that hard drive, right? You're kind of like helping your brain to learn something different. Right?
Oh, that makes perfect sense. I love that. I love that. So the next time I find myself in a situation where I have a thought that comes from bias, which I know that I do.
We all do.
We all do. Then it's a good idea to think back and just to check myself a minute, sit with it, as you said, and realize that I've had that thought. And then think about my experiences that may speak to why that thought about that person or group, et cetera, is off base.
Right.
And sort of check myself on that. I love that. That's a good tip. Now, when does implicit bias become racism? Or, I mean, I guess those two don't have to exist together, but since we all have bias, how is racism different?
Right. So racism takes bias or prejudice, right, and adds power. So we say it's like a math equation. So while we know that everyone can be biased, not every group can be racist. And this is where my students kind of like really start to push back on me, because I get them. I have a captive audience when I'm talking about bias, and then when we get into the talking about racism, and again, if we had more time, there are actually many different types of racism. This is a larger conversation, so maybe I can come back another day and do a 101 on that. But it's prejudice plus power. So if we look at, yes, everyone has prejudice or bias, but not everyone holds power, right? So if we look at who are the group of people historically and currently who hold power, right? And I'm not just talking about like that individual down the street who's wealthy, who might be a person of color who has power in that company. But we're talking about like in the United States, and I would say globally, who holds institutional power.
Well, and that's white folks.
Right. Yeah. Exactly. And so that's where I feel like it's harder for some people to sit with, because you're like, so you're telling me only white people can be racist? Yeah. Everyone can be biased, but only, white people or people who identify as white or white passing can be racist, right? And so or can benefit from racism, right? And so that's where I think it's harder for people. And again, this is really a conversation for a longer like there's more learning to unpack. It's hard to just sort of drop this quote unquote package off and move on. But that's where I think it's important to put these things together, because even if you look at businesses that do bias training, it's not effective unless you talk about these things together and talk about ways to then move towards being anti-biased and anti-racist, both on an individual level and like a collective level. So that's just a little bit of information. I'd love to come back and talk about it more.
Oh, yeah. Yes, I would love that too. And so when someone like me wants to work hard at being a better ally, and I know that in your work, your nonprofit work as well as your professional work, you probably see a lot of white folks who say, "Oh, I'm not racist. I don't have any biases. I don't see color, and I think everyone's equal." And I know all this stuff because that's the world I grew up in. I've heard all that before. I've probably said some of that stuff myself. But where would someone start who says, "Wow, in 2025, I want to start checking myself and look at my own biases, and if I'm a racist, I need to change that."
Yeah, no, I think that's great. I mean, I think, I think first of all, the notion of colorblindness is not, that's a place to start by just saying that doesn't honor, the experiences of people of color.
I agree. I've always thought that was ridiculous because you're saying I'm going to deny who you are.
Exactly.
So that I can then accept you.
Right. And really so that I can feel comfortable, right?
Exactly.
It's really more like,
exactly.
So that would be one thing, is just to say like that doesn't provide comfort for anybody, but really for white folks. But so being color brave, like really, I honor who you are and what you bring, because it's a huge part of who you are. I would say, look at all of the ways that you get your information. So expand who's speaking into your life. So if you're a person who likes to listen to podcasts or read or watch documentaries, try to listen to voices of color who are speaking on issues of lived experience. I think that's an easy way, because a lot of times, I mean, what we say is that proximity is really important. I always say, proximity builds community, distance builds suspicion. That's not the exact quote, but that's
good,
a paraphrasing of it.
That's good though. So we have to sometimes place ourselves in positions where.
Yeah. And I think, a lot of people are like, well, I can't get up and move. I get that. You can't. But you can, proximity builds empathy. That's what it is. Distance builds suspicion. You may not be able to move your family or move your children to school, but, for some people that's a faith community, like literally leaving your faith community if it is all one race and going to another one. Where you sit under the leadership of someone of color. I think that can be important if that's something that applies for you, if that's a part of your, life. Maybe it's putting your kids in activities. Like for a while we would drive my daughter to theater lessons with a teacher of color, not just because he was a teacher of color, he was phenomenal, but like for both of those reasons, because I was like, if we're going to live in Williamson County, I'm going to try to get our kids out of Williamson County as much as possible, because everything around here is just like, it's too insulated.
Right. There's a lot of wealthy whiteness.
Yeah.
In Williamson
it's
County.
just, and again, that was at that season of life, we were able to do it. Other seasons we can't. So I'm not trying to stress anybody out. I know sometimes you just can't, but maybe it's like, I'm going to, instead of just going to the same public library, I'm going to go to the public library branch in Antioch and spend some time there and look at some other experiences of books and literature and, communities that are different from me. That's a free thing you could do, So I guess I'm speaking more on like for people with kids, but for individuals, think about how you're getting your information. A lot of people, I think it's the sort of self-education, looking at groups that you might be able to join that you can learn from. I mean, there's a lot of coalitions that exist in Nashville. There's certainly some in Williamson County that are advocating for issues of racial justice, that you can learn alongside people that are doing really great work. In Williamson County, there's groups.
And I like to look at, the things that you're saying to me, I'm hearing that there needs to be some intention about it.
Yeah.
I have to be intentional about it. And, I've had people before, some when I've instructed at the college level, ask about or disparage the phrase or the word diversity. And I like to keep things very simple. I'm very pragmatic. And I was teaching at the junior college level, but at the community college level. And some of those students have come from environments where they were exposed to very little diversity. And I like to say, look, if you love chocolate, and you're given a big bowl, and in that bowl, it's, 20% chocolate, 80% grapes, and you reach your hand down in there and get a handful, you're probably not going to have much chocolate. You may not have any. You're going to go back in and pick that chocolate out. You're intentional about, getting some diversity into what you're eating. And it's really kind of that simple. I mean, we have to understand that in our society, the ruling class is pretty much white people, and in Williamson County, certainly white people with money, but all over the country. And there's nothing wrong about being intentional about adding some diversity in.
Yeah.
Having come up from a corporate background, I've even been called before a diversity hire because and in fact, when I became a police officer, I was one of very few on the force. And for a long time, I was the only female on my entire shift. And And, of course, I had to overprove myself. All the things have to be done. However, I did have the privilege of the color of my skin, which got me the job to begin with, and being a female. And I was never really ashamed of the fact that I was hired because I was a female. They were trying to diversify the police force, which turned out to be a really good thing.
Right.
And I learned about that and how it was a great thing because of some of the things that I was asked to do. And I realized that I was able to use my background as a female and as a younger person to solve some problems without violence, that some of the men were not able to do, and they recognized it as well. It was really a learning experience for all of us when I showed up.
Sure.
It's like, okay, what's this woman going to do? Well, they soon learned that, in domestic situations, for example, this woman has a way to talk to people that maybe I don't possess. As a 55-year-old white man, this 22-year-old young girl, she's got a little something that I don't understand. And
Absolutely.
so we learned from each other.
Absolutely.
Anyway, so it's interesting when we talk about bias and racism and diversity and equity and inclusion. I know that there are many cases where I see great attempts at diversity and maybe even equity, but the inclusion part gets hard.
Mm-hmm.
Inclusion is different, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, I think when we really bring people in, I think it's one thing to have people come in, but it's another thing to fully want their ideas and perspectives at the table and then to implement them.
Right.
I've told my students that, and just people in general, that we should never hold a meeting about a group or an issue unless the people who are representing that issue are present. So there's a motto. I think it is from the disability justice world, and it says "Nothing about me without me."
Oh wow!
And I think that's
good.
Yeah, nothing about me without me, and I repeat that a lot. So if we're sitting at a table and we're talking about, issues around disability rights, or we're talking about racial justice issues, or we're talking about LGBTQIA issues, and we look around the table and nobody who is from that group is there, we need to stop.
That's a good point.
Right? Because
absolutely,
who are we then to continue to have this conversation? It's going to be, there's going to be missing voices, right? And so, I mean, it's not that we can have something, but we really can't. We need to recognize that there is an incomplete conversation,
right?
And it's probably going to have some stereotypes. And remember, it's not that, I always tell people, it's not that stereotypes are necessarily untrue, but they're incomplete. They're incomplete. So the conversation is going to be incomplete. And we need to recognize that. And so we need to make sure that we're bringing multiple voices to the table. And do we really want to hear what they're going to bring us? Because they're probably going to bring us some hard truths.
Right.
And are we ready to implement those things?
Right.
With fidelity and with integrity. And if we are, then we're ready to do the work of inclusion. And if we're not, then we're probably not ready for that.
Right. Right. That's a good point. And I've had experience with a disabled spouse, my former spouse, and he was in a wheelchair. And I remember many instances where we would get somewhere and it would say handicap accessible, and we would think, who designed this?
Yeah.
This is not all that acceptable. Yeah, you threw a ramp up, but you didn't realize that at the top, the turn is so tight that the caregivers essentially got to hang off the rails in order to get this chair to, just all sorts of situations like that. And it would, And so I can see exactly what you're saying. I'm assuming some engineer or construction person thought they were doing the right thing with probably the right motives, but forgot to ask a disabled person in a wheelchair, hey, how would this work? Are these angles right? How's this going to look for you? Right. Yeah, that's a good point.
We always say intent versus impact. We say, understand intent, but then look at the impact. If the impact is not or we say trust intent, but name impact. So if the intent of something, because a lot of times we go in with the right intentions,
Right.
but if the impact of that wasn't positive, if we're in a position of privilege, which is often the people sitting around the table in those big meetings,
Yeah.
if the impact wasn't felt correctly, we have to be able to someone has to be able to name that, and we have to be able to receive that feedback and say, that's okay. I didn't, I'm willing to take ownership of that and make a change.
And that's such good advice in any kind of organization, and when you're dealing with any kind of issue, whether it's in a faith-based organization or even just your own life. I come up with some harebrained idea I think is great, and I say, Paul, we're going to do this.
Mm-hmm.
And he says, what? And, I didn't include him in
Right.
this is a big idea.
Sure.
Maybe he doesn't want to get on the ladder and go 40 feet high to do some crazy idea I've got.
Sure. And I think that goes back to something I was going to say earlier when something else just came to me when you said, what else could something that, you or other people who may have anyone who has privilege. And again, it's not just racial privilege, whatever situation we might be stepping into where we may have some privilege or access or things. And I think it's also, I think about this a lot around the holiday season because a lot of people will step into quote unquote community service roles. And somebody pointed this out even before Christmas when people will buy gifts for families.
Right.
And they said, please don't ever use that term adopt a family, like when you're buying gifts. And I thought this was really important. Like, you're not adopting a family when you're buying gifts. You're just buying gifts. So you could say, sponsoring a family or just, purchasing gifts, but don't use the term adopt. The family doesn't need to be adopted.
That's a good point.
Yeah,
I never thought about
I know.
that. They're not orphans. They're a fully functioning family.
Exactly. And that was just that was just, it's not really small, it's big, but it was something that I thought about. But it's also, think about when you're positioning yourself, whether that's going into, an apartment to deliver gifts, or you're just going into, an organization where you're volunteering. Think about the conversation either you're having with your family or yourself before you're going in there. If you're thinking of yourself, and again, I'm not saying this to you, Peggy, I'm saying this to myself and to people in general. If you're sort of going in with this sort of heroic, like, oh gosh, I'm going in to make a difference, mentality, and thinking of the individuals that you're working with as, these kind of needy people versus like, these are our new friends that I'm going to go learn something from versus new individuals who I'm going to, who have such needs that I'm going to save. That's a very different paradigm. And I feel like there's a lot of people who go in with the mentality that these are broken people that are so lost and have nothing to offer, and because they are living in poverty, and yes, they are, and because they, may not have a lot of food in their fridge and not a lot of furniture in their homes. That is true, but I think we really have to think about our intentions. Again, it's that intent, and always center the dignity and worth of all people when we're going into spaces, because people have so much dignity and they have so much to offer.
Yes,
and they can
they
feel
do.
that.
Yeah. I agree. And this is really bringing us to the last thing we want to discuss, and I don't want to run out of time before we talk about this, is the grassroots work you're doing with individual families. And that is something that I just so love. And just to give the listeners a quick rundown of some of the work that Mona does. So Mona will present a need that that someone has, and it may be something like this: single mom, several kids, living in oftentimes government housing. She has a car, she has a job, she's self-sufficient as far as being able to keep some food on the table, get the kids to school, keep everybody clothed, etc. The car breaks down. Now, for many of us, if my car breaks down, I've got a lot of options, right? And I will say, though, that a lot of people, because my other business, as you know, is insurance, people freak out when they can't drive their car. Mm-hmm. It's a big, big deal. So transportation is super important. But if you're a person who's living on the edge and you fought to get some self-sufficiency, and that car means whether or not you can get to your job. Getting to the job means whether or not you get paid, and getting paid means whether or not you can stay in your housing situation, put food on the table for your children, etc. The car means a way to get the children where they need to go so that you can work. When the car breaks down, that is a huge financial risk for this family. It puts the whole family at risk. My car breaks down, I can call an Uber, I can get my husband. I mean, we've got another car. There are all kind of options. But many, many people don't have that. So what Mona does is she would present the need to us and say, this single mom's van has broken down and she needs, here's a bid for the $800 to repair the vehicle. Mona is part of a group, and she just presents the need to us, and some people can give $5, some people can give $500, but people give to the need. And then Mona goes the extra step of showing the receipt of where the money was paid directly to the shop to get the car repaired, to get this family back stable again. That is just incredible. And I don't know, how much money do you think you have collected for these kind of needs in the last 12 months? You have any idea?
I know. I mean, this is where I need another person to keep track of all this, because it's been a lot. I mean, again, I could never do it without our amazing group. My village is what I call it, helping us. I mean, literally, I feel like there are some days where I'm posting multiple needs. I mean, it's just thousands and thousands of dollars, because it's cars, it's eviction. I mean, families facing eviction. It's families whose food stamps have been cut. Lights have been turned off. These are families in desperate situations. It's not just like, things that are could wait a week or two, right? These are, as you said, things that are very, very desperate and on the edge. And again, it creates the snowball effect of one thing is lost, which leads to the bottom falling out. And for for any of us, if one of these things happens to me, I have 5 other lifelines I can call on, and it would never get to that point, at least, and not the case for these families.
So many people, so many parents don't have a soft place to land for their family.
Right.
If one thing goes bad, there's a work injury, the car breaks down, a child has a medical need, and all of a sudden they've got this bill that they've never had to deal with before, and these things can really take a family from being housed to unhoused.
Yeah.
So quickly. We don't really think about that, but particularly in an area like Nashville, and I know there's lots of listeners from all over the country, and there are areas like this all over the country where rent has gotten so high that they'll do anything to get somebody out so they can re-rent the apartment at a higher rate. It happens all the time. I did some volunteer work with legal aid, and it was just case after case after case of where these things were happening. So how is it that you find out about these needs and then are able to present those to us?
Well, the organization, and we have a name now called the Mothers Collective, and Mothers stands for Moms Offering Transformational Healing, Emotional Resources, and Support. So each of those letters has a meaningful name.
Oh, I love that.
Yeah, because that's really what we're doing. And so I want to stress that it's meeting the needs, oftentimes financial, of these tangible, bills or food or, clothing, furniture. We move a lot of furniture into folks' house, people who are unhoused, who are moving into a place for the first time, and getting folks to bring furniture to their place. But I want to stress that it's very relational. So I have a caseload of about, I'd say 20 moms who I check in on I don't check in on 20 of them every day, but there's about 20 of them that I am connected with, that I am, in constant contact with, that I'm doing case management and crisis intervention with regularly. And that's, thankfully I have a social work background, so I'm able to do that. And so that to me is the most valuable, or just as valuable as the meeting the financial and sort of resource needs, is to be able to some of them call me like their mentor or godmom, be able to be there for them through some pretty intense stuff. I've helped them get into mental health care. I've helped a couple who have had suicide attempts. I mean, some really heavy life stuff. And so to be in that trusted place and walk alongside moms for years, I mean, some of them since I moved to Nashville almost 10 years ago.
Wow.
So it's not just like I don't want it to sound like it's just transactional. It's not just a transactional. Some people just need a bed, right? And you hear from them a couple times and that's it. But most of them stay in touch long beyond, and I'll just get a Christmas text. Just wanted to wish you Merry Christmas and see how you're doing. And that's it, and so they know that love is there and that care. It's much more relational than transactional. But as far as how do we meet them? So a lot of the moms, I call them my OG moms. I've known them since I, first started doing a moms group in James Casey Homes, which is a public housing project in Nashville, about 9 years ago when I moved here. And those were some of the moms I first met, that I'm still in touch with, many of them. And then from there, I just grew a love for that community. I still do several community events with a dear friend. We do a big Thanksgiving event. We do a Christmas event. We do things all throughout the year there, kind of on the community level. And I met a lot of moms through there. And then from there, the word just spreads. I think when you're a trusted person that people know has a good heart, there's no shortage of people who need that. So the word just kind of spreads. And from there, I've also gotten to know a lot of people who work for different nonprofits. And so I've connected with the nonprofit leaders who will often reach out to me when they have families who, need furniture, need clothing, need support. Because there's often not organizations that provide provide the furniture or, again, food stamps are cut. Where do you go for groceries?
Right.
So it's not always just financial. It can also just be some of these other things that are in the form of, I'm helping somebody collecting money to get a grocery gift card or something else.
Right. Right. Well, and the model that you've grown for how this soon to be official nonprofit will work, as I said, is just really very interesting because, we know that there are people who have resources to give, and sometimes, they have a bias against people who might need resources, and they may think, if I give this money to them, they're just going to blow it, And so the model that you offer is, look, if you're somebody who's got those resources, you give it, and I'll give you the proof that it went straight to the grocery store, straight to the landlord, straight to the power company, straight to the car repairman. Right. And so I think that is important because, yes, for those people it is transactional, but it sounds to me like holistically there has to be a transactional aspect to it as well.
Yeah.
And that's okay.
Yeah.
If that's the need that someone can fill, then thank goodness they're filling that need.
Yeah.
So you're in the process of getting the 501c3. Is that what we're doing?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
When do you think that will happen?
We've got some of the paperwork to the state. And so hopefully within the next 6 months, I've got to do some other kind of logistical things of getting a business banking account and fully assembling a board for the organization and just some other things, but
sure.
My goal is in early 2025 to get things fully launched, getting a website and some intake forms and, some other things in place. But yeah, my goal is to get things more official.
That's exciting because, as you know, I just absolutely love being able to share just a few of my resources when needs arise.
Appreciate it so much.
And it is true that it makes me feel good to do it, and that's okay.
Yeah.
That doesn't mean I shouldn't do it. And it doesn't mean I'm doing it for myself, but it also does make me feel like good. I've actually helped someone keep afloat.
Right. And it does.
Yeah, keep afloat. And that's so important. Well, I have really enjoyed this, and I do definitely want to have you back because I want us to talk more in depth and sort of in a more educational way.
Sure.
About some of the things that we've discussed today. I know that Belmont is a private university, and that's a good thing because I suspect if you had the role you have in a public university in Tennessee, you would be fearful that role would be completely cut because that is the the way things are moving. DEI has become a dirty word, which I don't really understand why. Well, I do, but
Yeah,
that's another conversation. So I'm so glad that Belmont is offering this opportunity to you, and then of course to your students and to future educators. I just want to tell my listeners, one of the things that has always bothered me. We all have a background that we come from, and my background was as a child was pretty dysfunctional. It doesn't mean I didn't have food on the table. Actually, it rarely wound up actually on the table. We just kind of ate out of the refrigerator, but there was stuff in the refrigerator, okay? And the rent was usually paid, often very late, but it was usually paid. So I didn't have fear about where I would be living, but I did have a lot of fear about thinking about how I was going to fit in with everyone else when things would happen at school. For example, there would be a dress-up day at school. Okay, like the 100th day of school. You're supposed to dress up like an old person. I didn't really have an infrastructure around me that cared about getting me the outfit. And so I would show up in my regular school clothes. And I often think that and I'm just passing this on because maybe it's something you can talk to your students about. When schools do this kind of thing, when they have Spirit Week, when they have Dress Up Week, etc., many students don't have the opportunity to do that. And when you're sitting in the class and 80% of the class is all dressed up and you're not, it's a bad feeling for a child. And I just wish the schools would say, look, we've got a trunk of clothes in the room. Everybody come to school, and now we're all going to get into this trunk, and we're going to play dress up and look like an old person for the 100th day of school, et cetera. Sure. Instead of doing things like that just leave out some children, you know. And I think about, too, even our older students who have the opportunity to have extremely fast Wi-Fi in their home. They have computers. They have parents who are college educated, and you give a project out and you're gearing it towards those students and not the others who may need to go to a library, for example, to get a computer, but now they got to have a ride to the library and they got to pay to print things off. And I just hope that our new educators are thinking about those things, that people come from very different backgrounds. Well, this has been fun. I've learned a lot. I believe that my listeners have too. Mona, if someone wants to keep up with you and your work, how would they do that?
So I'm also hoping to just get at the very least a Facebook page for the organization, but
and it's called again
the Mothers Collective. I don't have that yet, but soon. But I'm happy to at least provide my email, maybe through a link through the podcast, an email to reach out to me.
Perfect. Yeah. We'll put that in the show notes. Put that in the show notes. That's great. I love that, and I love you spending your time being here today.
Thank you so much.
It's right after the holidays, so we're
it's a great way to spend a couple days after Christmas with you and share about things I'm so passionate about. So thank you.
And we're going to have you back because I want to start doing a few more of my episodes, just really heavy into education about certain issues. So we'll structure something and have you back. Thank you so much for being here. For all the listeners of Blue Lift, I hope you had a happy holiday season. 2025 offers lots of opportunity and lots of challenges, and we're going to meet those. We're going to be here with you to talk about some things. If you want to be a guest on Blue Lift and you've got something to offer, shoot me an email. And you can do that, Peggy at bluelift.com or peggykingsbury59@gmail.com. And if you know someone who would be a great guest, let me know about that. Well, share this episode with someone who needs to hear this information, and everyone make it a great day. And remember, every voice matters.